Hi everyone. Hope you're all keeping well. So last week I was supposed to obviously be teaching the class, but unfortunately I've been quite ill for the week or two before that. So only starting to kind of come around now, and it's kind of difficult to keep on top of everything. But Arndt was very good to jump in and continue on last week where he had left off from the previous week. So this week we're going to continue this idea of the sociocultural approach and look at how it's operationalized within teaching. I tried to locate the PowerPoint if there was a PowerPoint used by Arndt last week, but I wasn't able to find anything on Moodle. So I do apologize if some of what we're covering today was touched upon last week, but I've done my best to try and do a little bit of recapping and then moving it on from there. I know you focused quite strongly on dynamic assessment last week with Arndt. So we're going to look at the sociocultural approach and its operationalization in teaching this week. And obviously this is the last week of the taught portion of the module. As you guys know, after the Easter break, we have asked that you guys do your in-class presentations virtually via Teams. So we will be in touch with you guys via Moodle to organize that and make sure that everyone knows when exactly they're giving their presentation in what weeks and what times. Okay, so for today, I've structured the lecture along three main points, okay? So the first point is we're going to look at theory and practice within sociocultural theory and within SLA, okay? So a lot of what has been covered in the module so far has been very much theory driven. So I really, as an empiricist myself, and very much always focused on praxis, I think it's really important to talk about the relationship between theory and practice in sociocultural theory and in SLA in general. After that, we'll move on and we'll talk a little bit about Vygotsky and the zone of proximal development, just to recap that very, very briefly. What are the kind of main ideas behind that? And then from that, we'll move on and talk about sociocultural theory and pedagogy. And I know Arndt obviously touched a little bit on that last week with dynamic assessment. This week, what we'll look at is sociocultural theory and constructivism and how they feed into one another and how they are very much the dominant paradigm in a lot of foreign language teaching at the moment. And we'll also look at educational practice and concept-based instruction as also another very dominant pedagogical practice in implementing sociocultural theory into the teaching of foreign languages. So the relationship between theory and practice in sociocultural theory SLA. As we all know, and as Vygotsky has suggested, theories are extraordinary discoveries for learning environments which help people understand the phenomenon. Yeah, so theories are a very important aspect to understanding the learning environments and for improving the learning environments, because when we understand what happens in the most effective and successful learning environments, then we can attempt to replicate those sort of practices in another learning environment and hopefully achieve the same aims. But what's interesting about sociocultural theory, about Vygotsky in general, is that he argues rather than theory being deductive, he argues that theory should be inductively developed from the context. So what he's saying here very much is, he favors a grounded theory approach when working in the area of sociocultural theory within second language acquisition. So instead of creating a theory and testing out the hypotheses, he believes it makes more sense to study the learning environment, study the practices, and then from the ground up, from a kind of the basis of the data that you manage to collect on practices, that you build a theory that is grounded in the data rather than simply proposing a theory and testing the hypothesis in the real world. And we know that Vygotskian theoretical perspective emphasizes that organized methods of empirical research should be used to understand subjective, intersubjective, and distributed nature of learning and mental development. Okay, so again, we're talking here about very much focused on empirical research on learning environments to understand what's happening on a subjective level. So we're talking both in the case of the individual, intersubjective, so what is happening internally in terms of what the learner is doing and feeling and thinking and how they're engaging with the learning environment, and also then how that affects learning and mental development. Okay, so again, I suppose, and this is my chance to kind of plug it ever so slightly. So what we see here as well is that Vygotsky is a very strong advocate of a qualitative or a qualitatively driven approach to data collection to understand the subjective and intersubjective nature of learning environments and to try and identify the most successful practices for replication elsewhere. And obviously, if it makes sense from a very basic level that if we adopt a principled examination and analysis of what we know are fruitful learning experiences, then that can be really helpful, not only to allow us to replicate it in another context and potentially also reap the benefits there, but also to comprehend and improve the language learning experience in other contexts. Okay, so not only is it a useful tool to improve language learning in other contexts, it's also really useful for us to understand how language learning actually takes place. And in developing sociocultural theory, Vygotsky comments specifically on the relationship of theory and practice, and comments on the the prevailing situation in the social sciences up until a certain point, where practice was the poor brother, the poor relative of theory. Yeah. So what we see is that previously theory was not dependent on practice. What we see is that previously success or failure had practically no effect on the fate of theory. Okay. But what we see now in the social sciences is that it's the opposite. This is completely flipped on its head. What we started to see now is that theory is only deemed to be relevant and successful if it proves to be appropriate and fit for purpose in the real world and has been tested within a practical setting. Okay, so what we see nowadays is that practice pervades the deepest foundations of scientific operation and reforms it from beginning to end. Practice sets the tasks and serves as the supreme judge of theory as its truth criterion. It dictates how the construct of concepts and how to formulate the laws. Okay, so again, as I said earlier on, we're very much looking at a kind of a grounded theory approach to a lot of theory development nowadays, whereby we observe practices in the real world and use this data as the basis on which to construct theory, rather than creating theoretical hypotheses based on a very basic understanding of the environment or other studies that have been done and then testing them out in reality to see whether or not they work. We've kind of seen that relationship being flipped on its head, where theory is now emerging out of practice. Okay, and it makes a lot of sense if you think about it, because if we're talking about something like language learning, which is a very practically orientated process, then the most suitable ways of understanding that is adopting a kind of a grounded theory approach of looking at what's happening in the real world and then generating theories and hypotheses as a result of observed and analyzed practices. Okay, and obviously, following that particular logic then, for Vygotsky, the highest test of theory within this theory kind of practice dialectic is praxis. Yeah, so is the actual practical application of a particular theory. And we see in the work of Stetsenko and Aryevich, we see it reflected here, a similar kind of way of looking at the theory practice dialectic. There's nothing more practical than a good theory should be expanded to include the mirror expression, that there is nothing more theoretically rich than good practice. Okay, so again, looking at that kind of grounded theory approach to how these things work. Okay, and really what we also see in terms of sociocultural theory and Vygotsky, that this kind of praxis-based approach was a kind of a focal point to create a psychology that would promote the development of new processes rather than continuing to focus on observing existing ones. Okay, so taking that next step away from just observing what was going on, but also as a way of creating and developing new processes. Okay, so rather than just trying to understand the dynamics of what was going on, we wanted to start looking at practices in order to develop new and better ways of doing certain things. And obviously a praxis-based approach to sociocultural theory has been applied certainly within the educational context where a lot of foreign language learning takes place, but certainly it's been applied beyond the educational context and beyond the language learning context. And we see, for example, in medical settings, so this kind of praxis-based approach to sociocultural theory is very important in training doctors in how to not only engage with patients, deal with their families, but also, learning by doing and learning from the best practices of people who are actually practicing their craft on a daily basis. And likewise within economic and political domains as well, by observing praxis and determining what works well, we can make very well informed decisions about how we can develop theories to understand the situation and to improve the situation. And we see that it's in the L2 learning context and the foreign language learning context within the zone of proximal development, we see a beginning of this praxis-based approach to L2 education in the work of Landolf and Aljafrey. And when we're talking about Vygotsky's proposal about mediation within the zone of proximal development, we know, and we've started studying that in quite a lot of detail, that this kind of sociocultural approach, this praxis-based approach to sociocultural theory, is an important part of what school learning brings to the developmental process. Okay, so very quickly again, just recapping Vygotsky's his propositions and the zone of proximal development. So according to Vygotsky, learners co-create knowledge through interaction with social and internal individual worlds. Okay, so we have these domains, these overlapping spheres and domains, and learners, they co-create knowledge by socially interacting with other people in the classroom, but then also in interacting with their internal world. So looking at their prior knowledge and the knowledge levels that they have currently and figuring out a way to marry that with the new knowledge that they're experiencing. And so a sociocultural approach to communication assists learners to acquire from each other and from more able peers, for example, teachers and parents. Okay, so we can create a situation in the classroom where students can learn from one another, particularly if there are some students in the class who are whose zone of proximal development is broader than the other students. They can assist and students can learn from them in a kind of a peer learning situation, but then also from parents and teachers. And a very strong anchor of Vygotsky's work is obviously based on the idea that mental and educational developments of a person are connected to social, cultural, and the historical context in which a person is situated. So, moving away from the purely cognitive view that all internal processes or all language learning processes and language acquisition processes are cognitive and are cognitively focused, and there are patterns that are replicated across individuals. Vygotsky argues contrarily that really it's the social, cultural, and historical context within which the person is situated that has quite a significant effect on their mental development and their educational development, their learning. Okay, so we'll leave it there for this part and we'll continue in part 2 in a moment.